At exactly 2:52 a.m. on September 23rd, 2024, Harold Hal Jennings was reconnecting empty armored cars to his freight train when headlights cut through the darkness of Pinedale Canyon. Supervisor Eddie Morrison's patrol vehicle was approaching, and $26 million in recovered Federal Reserve currency was still sitting exposed in Jake Morrison's broken-down logging truck just 50 yards away. Hal had 90 seconds to explain why there were fresh wheel marks on an abandoned rail spur, why his routine brake inspection had taken 47 minutes, and why his 20-year colleague shouldn't look too closely at the lumber mill loading. Doc. One wrong word would mean federal prison for unauthorized recovery, but staying silent would mean a serious health crisis for an entire town, harmed by 30 years of corporate environmental neglect. But this story didn't start with a 65-year-old conductor executing the perfect recovery operation while his best friend unknowingly tried to catch him. It started 6 months earlier when Hal discovered his railroad was deliberately harming the community he'd spent his life serving. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. Now let's get back to the story. Hal's phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, jarring him from restless sleep in his small railroad apartment. Dr. Martinez's voice was shaking, barely controlled panic bleeding through the speaker. Hal, you need to get to the hospital right now. Sarah's taken a turn for the worse. Her vitals are dropping and we can't stabilize her. Hal's blood turned to ice. Sarah Morrison, the 12-year-old girl who'd become like a granddaughter to him, had been fighting cancer for 8 months. The doctors said her case was unusual. Aggressive, fast-spreading, unlike anything they'd seen in pediatric patients. I'm on my way, Hal said, throwing on his Union Pacific jacket and work boots. He drove through empty streets to Pinedale General Hospital, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. Sarah lay unconscious in the pediatric intensive care unit, her small body dwarfed by machines and tubes. Her mother Jenny sat beside the bed, tears streaming down her face. At 32, Jenny looked like she'd aged a decade in the past year. The cancer's spreading faster than we thought, Dr. Martinez explained to Hal in the hallway. Her liver function is declining. And she's not the only one, Hal. We've had 47 new cancer cases in the past 6 months. All the same type, aggressive liver and kidney cancers. All in families living within 2 miles of the rail yard. Hal felt like someone had punched him in the gut. He'd known Sarah since she was 3 years old, when her father Tom died in a logging accident. Hal had stepped in as a surrogate grandfather, teaching her to fish, helping with homework, attending every school play. Seeing her pale face connected to life support machines broke something fundamental inside him. What's causing it, Doc? 47 cases can't be coincidence. Dr. Martinez pulled out a thick folder of test results. Groundwater contamination. The EPA ran comprehensive tests last month after I reported the cancer cluster. Chemical levels are 400% above federal safety limits. Heavy metals, industrial solvents, things that have no business being in drinking water. Jenny looked up from Sarah's bedside, her voice hollow. They're saying the whole town has to evacuate. 8 weeks, maybe less. The water isn't safe to drink, to bathe in, to cook with. Everything we've built here is poisoned. Hal spent the rest of the night at Sarah's bedside, holding her small hand and watching the monitors. When she woke up at dawn, her eyes were glassy from medication, but she recognized him. Uncle Hal, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The kids at school say we're all going to get very sick. They say our town is cursed. Why won't someone help us? We didn't do anything wrong. Those words would echo in Hal's mind for weeks. We didn't do anything wrong. A 12-year-old girl asking why the system had abandoned her. That afternoon, Hal returned to the Union Pacific dispatch office for his regular shift. He'd been a conductor for 43 years, started when he was 22, and never looked back. He knew every inch of track from Salt Lake City to Reno, every signal light, every grade crossing, every maintenance shed. The railroad was his life, and Pinedale was his home. But today, something in the Daily Cargo Manifest caught his attention like a neon sign. Special Federal Reserve Transport, UP 4472, the document read. Contents, $26 million in condemned series currency destined for destruction at Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, Nevada facility. Hal stared at the paper, his mind racing. The EPA had estimated Pinedale's complete environmental cleanup would cost $18 million. The money on that train was real U.S. currency, just old series bills being taken out of circulation and incinerated. $26 million that would literally go up in smoke while Sarah and 46 other cancer patients faced death because nobody would pay for cleanup. During his lunch break, Hal accessed the Union Pacific Environmental Compliance Database using his senior conductor credentials. What he found in the files made his blood run cold and his hands shake with rage. 30 years of shipping records showed regular industrial cleaning supply transports through Pinedale and surrounding areas. Hundreds of carloads marked as routine chemical deliveries. But when Hal cross-referenced the shipping codes with EPA hazardous materials classifications, the truth became crystal clear. These weren't cleaning supplies at all. They were toxic chemical waste, industrial solvents, heavy metals, carcinogenic compounds, deliberately mislabeled and illegally dumped in rural areas far from corporate headquarters and regulatory oversight. An internal memo from 1994 made the railroad's knowledge explicit. Groundwater contamination detected in Pinedale area following chemical waste disposal operations. Environmental engineering recommends discontinuing waste disposal activities immediately to prevent long-term liability exposure, but the shipments hadn't stopped. They'd continued for 30 more years, right up until last month. The next document hit Hal like a freight train at full speed. A classified report labeled Project Clearance required conductor-level access codes to view. Hal's hands shook as he entered his credentials and watched the damning text appear on his screen. Strategic Land Acquisition Initiative for Western Rail Corridor Expansion. Phase 1. Allow affected communities to depopulate naturally through environmental decline. Phase 2. Acquire abandoned properties at significant discount from distressed sellers. Phase 3. Resume profitable freight operations without environmental liability constraints. The railroad had been systematically harming small towns along their routes, waiting for residents to become ill or move away in desperation, then buying up the abandoned land for pennies on the dollar. It was systematic environmental harm disguised as business strategy. Hal scrolled through victim statistics that read like a legal prosecution case. 312 cancer cases directly linked to railroad contamination across 17 towns. 89 confirmed fatalities while families fought hopeless legal battles against corporate lawyers. Medical expenses that bankrupted entire communities while railroad executives received bonus payments for efficient waste management. One name in the victim database stopped Hal's heart. Tommy Morrison, age 9, who had passed away from the neighboring town of Riverside. Sarah's cousin. The boy had passed 6 months ago while his family waited for legal resolution of their contamination claim. At the bottom of the classified file, Hal found budget documents that made his stomach turn. $800 million had been transferred from environmental cleanup reserves to executive compensation packages over the past decade. The money earmarked for fixing their mess had been stolen and paid out as bonuses to the people who created the mess. The next morning, Hal drove to the abandoned Pinedale lumber mill that had closed 8 years earlier when the local economy collapsed. The rail spur that once carried timber shipments hadn't been used since, but the track was still solid, the manual switching mechanism still functional. The loading dock was hidden from the main railroad line by a hill and had direct access to county roads. Hal stood on that empty platform for over an hour, looking at the rusted equipment and broken windows, thinking about Sarah's question, why won't they help us? The answer was simple and terrible. They never intended to help. They intended to let everyone become ill and profit from the aftermath. Hal spent the next week studying Federal Reserve money transports. His conductor access gave him cargo manifests, security protocols, and route schedules. The condemned currency runs happened monthly. 2 armored cars attached to regular freight trains, carrying old bills for incineration. On Saturday, Hal visited Sarah in the hospital. She was weak, her skin yellow from liver dysfunction. The doctors say we might have to move to Denver, Sarah whispered. I don't want to leave you, Uncle Hal. You're not going anywhere, sweetheart. Uncle Hal's going to fix this. How can one old railroad man fix anything? This old railroad man knows things they don't think he knows. Hal researched railroad environmental crimes at the state library. He found dozens of similar cases, small towns poisoned, families destroyed, communities abandoned when cleanup costs exceeded profits. He also discovered Maria Santos, a former Union Pacific environmental inspector who'd been fired for reporting Pinedale contamination. Her termination letter cited failure to comply with corporate environmental reporting protocols. Essentially, she'd been fired for trying to save lives. Hal downloaded every document showing corporate knowledge of deliberate contamination. 30 years of evidence proving willful environmental destruction. He stored copies in a safety deposit box in Cheyenne. Yard supervisor Eddie Morrison approached Hal during shift change. "You've been checking unusual manifests lately. Federal Reserve transports, environmental reports. That's not your usual paperwork." "Just keeping up with safety protocols," Hal replied. Eddie wasn't convinced but trusted his 20-year colleague. That evening, Dr. Martinez called with devastating news. The town council has to decide, accept the railroad's settlement offer or fight in federal court. What's the settlement? $50,000 total for the entire town of 847 residents. $59 per person after 30 years of deliberate poisoning. What happens if we fight it? 20 years of litigation while everyone suffers. The railroad has unlimited legal resources. We don't. Hal made his decision. The system had failed, but he wouldn't fail Sarah or his community. He opened his laptop and began studying the next Federal Reserve transport schedule. The condemned currency transport was scheduled for Tuesday night, September 23rd. Hal had been assigned as primary conductor. Perfect timing. He had 2 weeks to prepare. Every detail had to be perfect. One mistake would mean federal prison and Sarah's deteriorating condition. But Hal had 43 years mastering freight train operations. He knew every bolt, every coupling mechanism, every override protocol in the system. The abandoned lumber mill rail spur was the key. During his days off, Hal surveyed the location. The manual switching mechanism still worked after 8 years of disuse. The loading dock was hidden from the main line and had direct access to county roads. He approached Jake Morrison, Eddie's unemployed brother, who'd lost his job when the mill closed. Jake was struggling to support his family and bitter about how the railroad's environmental destruction had killed the local economy. "I need your help with something important," Hal told Jake. "Something that could save our town but might put us both in serious trouble." Jake looked skeptical until Hal showed him the contamination documents. Jake's face went pale as he read the evidence of deliberate poisoning and corporate cover-ups. "They killed my father," Jake said quietly. "Dad worked at the mill for 30 years, never smoked, ate healthy. Then he got liver cancer and died in 6 months." "Now you know why," Hal said, "and why we can't wait for the system to fix itself." Hal explained the Federal Reserve transport operation. $26 million in condemned currency that would be incinerated anyway, while their community faced death because nobody would pay $18 million for cleanup. "How do we know this will work?" Jake asked. "Because I've been running freight trains longer than you've been alive. I know every coupling system, every emergency protocol, every override code, and I know exactly how to make $26 million disappear." The plan was elegant. Federal Reserve transports used 2 armored cars attached to regular freight consists. During the remote section through Pinedale Canyon, Hal would initiate an emergency stop for brake pressure irregularities. While dispatch handled the mechanical issue, he would decouple the armored cars and let gravity roll them down the lumber. Mill Spur, where Jake would be waiting with a modified logging truck. Every action would be documented as standard railroad procedure. Emergency stops were routine. Car decoupling during mechanical issues was normal protocol. The genius was that it wouldn't look like a heist. It would look like mechanical failure and emergency response. Jake modified his logging truck with hidden compartments and researched secure storage locations owned by his extended family across 3 states. On September 20th, 3 days before the heist, Regional Manager Patricia Wells returned early from her vacation in Colorado and immediately ran a comprehensive security audit of recent system access. She found unusual patterns in Hal's computer usage that set off alarm bells in her corporate trained mind. "Eddie, I need you to watch Hal Jennings very closely over the next few days," she told the yard supervisor in a closed-door meeting. "Something's not right. He's been accessing files he has no business reviewing, Federal Reserve manifests, abandoned rail infrastructure reports, environmental compliance documents. The pattern doesn't make sense for routine conductor duties." Eddie's response surprised her. "You really think Hal's planning something illegal?" The man's been a model employee for over 4 decades. Perfect safety record, never missed a shift, always follows protocols to the letter. That's exactly what makes this concerning, Patricia replied. Model employees don't suddenly start studying Federal Reserve transports and environmental contamination data unless they're planning something. I want you to keep detailed logs of his activities and report anything unusual immediately. What if he's just being thorough with safety compliance? Corporate's been pushing enhanced documentation requirements. Maybe, but given the recent environmental issues in Pinedale and Hal's personal connection to affected families, I'm worried he might do something desperate. The company's gotten death threats over the contamination situation. People are angry and looking for someone to blame. That same evening, Hal made his final hospital visit to see Sarah before the operation. She was sleeping when he arrived, her breathing shallow but steady, her small body fighting a battle she shouldn't have to fight. Jenny was reading in the chair beside the bed, looking exhausted and hopeless. "Any improvement?" Hal asked quietly. Jenny shook her head. "The experimental treatment isn't working. Insurance won't cover anything else. We're looking at maybe 2 weeks left, according to Dr. Martinez." Hal kissed Sarah's forehead and whispered, "Everything's going to be okay, sweetheart. Uncle Hal made you a promise, and he's going to keep it. Just hold on a little longer." When Sarah's eyes fluttered open, she managed a weak smile. "Uncle Hal, I had a dream that you fixed everything, that our town was clean again and all the sick people got better." "Dreams have a way of coming true sometimes," Hal said, "especially when good people fight for what's right. Will you stay until I fall asleep again?" "Of course, sweetheart." Hal sat by her bedside until midnight, holding her hand and planning the most important 30 minutes of his life. Tuesday, September 23, 2024, 2:05 a.m. Hal began the Federal Reserve transport run exactly on schedule, pulling UP 4472 with 37 freight cars and 2 armored cars carrying $26 million in condemned currency. The freight train rolled through Wyoming darkness at 47 miles per hour. Tonight was different. Tonight he was about to commit what the law would call theft, but his conscience called justice. At 2:17 a.m., they reached Pinedale Canyon. Hal initiated the emergency brake sequence and contacted dispatch. "Control, this is UP 4472, reporting brake pressure irregularities. Initiating emergency stop procedures at mile marker 247. Copy, 4472. Confirm your cargo status. Cargo secure. This appears to be a brake system malfunction, not a security issue." The train halted exactly where Hal had planned. Rear cars aligned with the lumber mill spur junction. The Federal Reserve guards remained in their secured positions while the conductor handled the apparent mechanical issue. Hal climbed down with his equipment, moving with practiced efficiency. Using his master conductor key, he accessed the coupling mechanism between freight cars and armored cars. At 2:22 a.m., he entered the decoupling sequence. The armored cars detached smoothly and began rolling toward the lumber mill spur. "Control, I've isolated the problematic cars for inspection. May need backup locomotive." "Copy, 4472. What's your estimated repair time?" "Could be 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on brake component replacement." Jake Morrison waited with a modified logging truck behind the loading dock. At 2:28 a.m., the first complication arose. One coupling mechanism jammed, requiring Hal to use a crowbar. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet canyon. At 2:41 a.m., Jake's truck wouldn't start, leaving $26 million exposed while precious seconds ticked away. 4472, this is Supervisor Morrison. I'm en route with diagnostic equipment. Eddie was coming. Hal had 5 minutes to complete the money transfer and reconnect the cars. At 2:47 a.m., Jake got the engine running. They transferred the currency to hidden compartments with desperate efficiency. At 2:52 a.m., Eddie Morrison's patrol vehicle appeared on the canyon access road, its headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Hal's heart hammered against his ribs as he worked to reconnect the empty armored cars, his hands moving with the same steady precision they'd used for 43 years, even as his mind screamed warnings. $26 million in recovered federal currency sat 50 yards away in Jake's logging truck. If Eddie walked toward the lumber mill loading dock, if he decided to investigate the spur tracks more closely, if Jake made any noise trying to fix his engine, everything would be over. Sarah would deteriorate rapidly. The town would face a health crisis, and Hal would spend his remaining years in federal prison. "Everything under control here, Hal," Eddie called out as he climbed from his vehicle, flashlight in hand. "Just finishing the brake system check," Hal replied, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Turned out to be a faulty pressure sensor in the pneumatic control line. Nothing major, but it was throwing off the readings enough to trigger emergency protocols. Eddie approached slowly, his supervisor's eyes taking in every detail of the scene. His flashlight beam swept across the train cars, the coupling mechanisms, the surrounding canyon walls. 20 years of working together meant Eddie could read Hal's moods, could sense when something wasn't quite right. "Funny thing about pressure sensors," Eddie said, his tone casual but probing. "Usually when they fail, you get consistent false readings, not fluctuating ones." Hal's mouth went dry, but his response came without hesitation. That's what made this one tricky to diagnose. The intermittent failure pattern suggested either contamination in the airlines or a loose connection in the sensor housing itself. Eddie nodded slowly, but his flashlight kept moving, scanning the area with professional thoroughness. The beam passed over the lumber mill spur, illuminating the fresh wheel marks that Hal prayed looked like routine maintenance activity. "That old spur track's been dead for 8 years, Eddie observed, taking a step toward the junction. "Why are there fresh wheel marks on the rails?" This was the moment. Everything depended on Hal's next words. In the distance, he could hear Jake's truck engine turning over unsuccessfully, the sound barely audible, but definitely there. If Eddie heard it, if he connected that sound to the fresh tracks, if his 20 years of railroad experience told him something was wrong, had to test the switching mechanisms as part of the brake inspection protocol, Hal said, his voice calm and professional despite the terror clawing at his chest. "When you're dealing with pneumatic irregularities like this, procedure requires checking all related systems in the immediate area to isolate the problem source. Can't have a faulty spur switch affecting mainline operations." Eddie's flashlight lingered on the tracks for what felt like an eternity. Hal could see his friend's mind working, processing the explanation, weighing it against his instincts. Behind Eddie's shoulder, Hal caught a glimpse of movement near the loading dock. Jake, still struggling with his engine. "Makes sense," Eddie finally said, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "You always were thorough with safety protocols." 43 years on the rails, Hal replied, allowing himself the smallest hint of relief. "Old habits." Eddie nodded and turned his attention back to the train, but Hal knew his friend well enough to recognize the lingering doubt in his posture. He'd passed this test, but barely. At 2:58 a.m., Patricia Wells arrived, determined to oversee any unusual Federal Reserve incidents. "What's the situation?" she called. "Brake pressure irregularity," Eddie replied. "Hal's got it handled." Patricia inspected the train, checking connections and reviewing manifests. Everything appeared normal, but something nagged at her instincts. "Hal, I need to ask about your recent computer access patterns. You've been reviewing Federal Reserve manifests and environmental reports outside your normal duties." Hal was prepared. "I've been developing enhanced safety protocols for hazardous materials transport. Environmental reports help me understand contamination risks, and infrastructure data helps identify emergency response options." It was a logical explanation. Patricia found no fault with the reasoning. At 3:15 a.m., the investigation concluded. The train resumed its journey with 2 armored cars that appeared to contain $26 million, but were actually empty. The money was already hidden in Jake's truck, heading towards secure storage locations for environmental cleanup and medical treatment. By 6 a.m., Jake's logging truck had reached its primary destination, a storage facility in Montana owned by his cousin's construction company. Following Hal's detailed instructions, they divided the $26 million into smaller caches and transported them to secure locations across 3 states, ensuring no single discovery could compromise the entire operation. At 8 a.m., while Hal slept peacefully in his railroad apartment, the delayed release computer program he'd spent weeks developing activated automatically. Sophisticated algorithms began systematically uploading 30 years of environmental contamination evidence to carefully selected recipients: investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, environmental protection groups, medical researchers, and affected community leaders. The EPA received complete documentation of illegal chemical waste disposal operations, including shipping manifests, disposal site coordinates, and chemical composition data. The FBI Environmental Crimes Unit gained real-time access to corporate cover-up files, internal memos discussing acceptable casualty levels, and budget documents showing deliberate fund diversion from cleanup to executive compensation. Medical journals received previously suppressed health data linking specific railroad operations to cancer cluster development, along with evidence that corporate officials had actively prevented publication of studies connecting their activities to community illness patterns. At 9:30 a.m., Patricia Wells received a call that would change everything. The Federal Reserve Facility Supervisor in Nevada was calling with disturbing news. The armored cars were completely empty when they arrived, the supervisor reported. No currency, no shipping documentation, no evidence there was ever anything in those cars. Where's the $26 million that was supposed to be in this shipment? That's impossible, Patricia replied, her corporate confidence wavering. Our manifest shows full transport. I personally inspected those cars myself less than 7 hours ago. The guards confirmed secure cargo status throughout the journey. Well, they're empty now. We're talking about $26 million in missing federal currency. This is going to trigger a major federal investigation. Patricia immediately called Eddie Morrison, her mind racing through the implications of a missing Federal Reserve shipment. Eddie, we have a serious problem. The Nevada facility says the money never arrived. The armored cars were empty. Eddie's blood ran cold as the pieces suddenly fell into place. The fresh wheel marks at the lumber mill spur, Hal's unusual computer access patterns, the brake pressure irregularity that had seemed routine, but occurred at the perfect location for cargo transfer. The timing that placed them in the most remote section of the route during minimal supervisory coverage. I need to talk to Hal immediately, Eddie said. But when they reached Hal's railroad apartment, he was gone. A handwritten note on his kitchen table contained a simple message. Check your email. The truth about what happened to Pinedale is finally coming out. The system failed our community, so I made sure our community wouldn't fail. At 11 a.m., news organizations across the country began receiving the story that would dominate headlines for months. 30 years of meticulously documented corporate malfeasance. Internal memos discussing rural communities as acceptable casualty zones. Budget records showing $800 million diverted from environmental cleanup to executive bonuses while families died of preventable cancers. The headlines wrote themselves within hours. Railroad conductor exposes decades of deadly contamination. The hero who stole millions to save dying towns. Freight train robbery reveals environmental genocide. By noon, environmental advocacy groups were hailing Hal Jennings as the most important whistleblower in American environmental history. Cancer patients and their families organized rallies demanding immediate corporate accountability and federal intervention. At 2 p.m., FBI agents arrested 3 Union Pacific executives on federal environmental terrorism charges. Corporate headquarters in Omaha was raided by federal marshals. Financial records dating back 3 decades were seized as evidence in what prosecutors called the largest environmental crimes case in American history. The stolen money investigation quickly became secondary to the environmental crimes investigation. Federal prosecutors faced an unprecedented legal and ethical dilemma. How do you charge someone with theft when they have exposed environmental crimes worth billions of dollars and potentially saved thousands of lives? Patricia Wells, realizing she faced her own criminal charges for knowledge of the contamination cover-up, made the strategic decision to cooperate fully with federal investigators. Her detailed testimony provided prosecutors with insider evidence of corporate knowledge, systematic cover-ups, and explicit executive orders to ignore safety violations and health impacts. The board of directors knew about Pinedale contamination as early as 1994, Patricia testified under oath. The decision was made at the highest corporate levels that it would be more cost-effective to let affected communities depopulate naturally than to pay for environmental remediation. Eddie Morrison became a crucial witness for the prosecution, describing corporate pressure to ignore environmental violations, suppress health impact documentation, and prioritize profit margins over community safety. The case expanded rapidly as federal investigators discovered a coordinated network of contaminated sites across 8 western states. The environmental crimes involved $4.2 billion in deliberately avoided cleanup costs, affecting over 50,000 families across multiple communities. 6 months later, Harold Jennings walked into federal court in Denver, to testify against his former employer in what legal experts called the most significant environmental crimes trial in American history. He had been granted full immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation, but the real victory was visible in the courtroom gallery. Sarah Morrison, now healthy and cancer-free after treatment funded by recovered railroad assets, sat with her mother in the front row. Pinedale's groundwater had been completely cleaned using advanced filtration technology, and the town was experiencing an economic renaissance as environmental cleanup operations created hundreds of new jobs. "Mr. Jennings," the federal prosecutor began, "can you explain to the jury how you first discovered the contamination conspiracy that forms the basis of this case?" "I was trying to save my town and the people I love," Hal replied, looking directly at the defense table where former railroad executives sat in federal custody. A 12-year-old girl was dying of cancer caused by 30 years of illegal chemical dumping. The same company that had $800 million for executive bonuses claimed they couldn't afford $18 million to clean up the poison they deliberately created. So you decided to steal $26 million from a federal reserve transport. I recovered money that was scheduled for destruction anyway and redirected it towards saving lives that corporate executives had written off as acceptable casualties. They stole billions from affected communities through environmental destruction. I stole it back. The defense attorney attempted to portray Hal as a common criminal who had used his position to commit federal theft, but the overwhelming documentary evidence made that narrative impossible to sustain. 30 years of internal corporate communications proved deliberate environmental destruction. Hundreds of preventable deaths were directly linked to corporate decisions that prioritized profit over public health. Over 5 grueling days of testimony, Hal provided federal prosecutors with detailed evidence that led to historic criminal convictions. 34 railroad executives received federal prison sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years. The Union Pacific Corporation was fined $4.2 billion and placed under permanent federal environmental oversight. Patricia Wells served 18 months in minimum security federal prison, then worked as an unpaid consultant helping other environmental whistleblowers navigate the legal system. "Hal Jennings showed me what real integrity looks like," she said in a televised interview. "I spent 20 years following corporate orders that I knew were wrong. He spent one night doing something illegal that was absolutely right." Eddie Morrison was promoted to Director of Environmental Safety Enforcement for the Reformed Railroad, implementing new monitoring protocols that became the industry standard for preventing environmental crimes and protecting whistleblowers. The case triggered nationwide environmental reform legislation. 847 contaminated sites received emergency federal cleanup funding. New environmental oversight agencies were created with enforcement powers that transcended corporate influence. The railroad industry faced unprecedented accountability requirements and criminal liability for environmental violations. Pinedale became a model community for environmental recovery and economic revitalization. The town's population doubled as cleanup efforts created sustainable employment opportunities. Sarah's family remained in their hometown, which had been transformed from a dying community into a thriving example of environmental justice. 5 years after the Midnight Run heist, Harold Jennings worked as Director of Environmental Safety for the completely reformed Union Pacific Railroad. His annual salary of $150,000 reflected his true value after 43 years of dedicated service and his unique expertise in environmental protection protocols. The Jennings Protocol became the national standard for railroad environmental monitoring, featuring real-time contamination detection systems, automated safety violation reporting, and comprehensive whistleblower protections that prevented corporate retaliation against employees who reported environmental crimes. Sarah Morrison, now 17 years old and studying environmental engineering at the University of Wyoming, worked part-time at the Environmental Monitoring Center that had been named in her honor. The Sarah Morrison Environmental Protection Center had successfully prevented dozens of potential contamination incidents through early detection and rapid response protocols. "Uncle Hal," Sarah said one afternoon as they reviewed monitoring data together, "do you ever regret what you did that night? Breaking the law, risking everything, changing so many lives?" Hal looked out the window at Pinedale's clean streets, healthy children playing in parks built on formerly contaminated land, and families who had been given a second chance at life. "I regret that it took me so long to do the right thing," he replied. "I regret that I didn't act sooner, before Tommy Morrison and so many others died unnecessarily." But you broke federal law. You committed a serious crime. Sometimes the law fails to protect innocent people, and ordinary citizens have to make extraordinary choices to ensure justice prevails. But real justice always finds a way to emerge, even when the system seems completely broken. Every year on Sarah's birthday, anonymous donations appeared to fund cancer research and environmental cleanup operations in communities across the country. Federal investigation revealed the funding came from recovered assets seized during prosecutions of other environmental crimes that had been exposed following Hal's example. The legend of the railroad conductor who stole millions to save dying towns became a powerful symbol for environmental justice advocates, and a cautionary tale that deterred corporate executives from engaging in environmental crimes. Hal's story was taught in business schools as an example of how individual conscience can triumph over institutional corruption. In his final report as Director of Environmental Safety, Hal wrote, "The greatest crime is not theft of money that was destined for destruction anyway. The greatest crime is allowing children to die from preventable illness while corporate executives profit from their suffering. The system failed our community when we needed it most. We didn't fail our community when it needed us most." On the 10th anniversary of the Midnight Run heist, Sarah Morrison graduated summa cum laude with her doctorate in environmental engineering from Stanford University. At the graduation ceremony, she announced her first major research project, developing artificial intelligence early warning systems to detect corporate environmental crimes before they could harm communities. "My inspiration for this work," she told the audience of families, faculty, and fellow graduates, "is a railroad conductor who showed me that sometimes the most moral action requires breaking immoral laws. He taught me that individual courage can overcome institutional failure when innocent lives are at stake." After the ceremony, Sarah drove back to Wyoming and visited the Pinedale Cemetery where Tommy Morrison and other contamination victims had been buried. She placed fresh flowers on each grave and whispered a promise. "Uncle Hal kept his word to all of you. No other children will die the way you did. We made sure of that." That evening, she found Hal sitting on his porch, reading a letter from the Environmental Protection Agency. A potential contamination site had been discovered in Montana. But this time, the railroad industry was responding immediately with comprehensive cleanup protocols, medical monitoring for affected residents, and full transparency about environmental risks. The system was finally working the way it should have worked all along. "The system works now," Hal said, folding the letter. "No more Pinedales. No more dying children. No more corporate cover-ups that value profit over human life." Sarah smiled as she sat beside the man who had saved her life and transformed their community. "No more midnight run heists either." "I hope you're right about that," Hal replied. "But if there ever are more environmental crimes like what happened here, I hope there will always be someone brave enough to pull the emergency brake on injustice." As the sun set over the clean, thriving town of Pinedale, Sarah realized the most important lesson Uncle Hal had taught her. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to justice requires the courage to act when legal systems fail to protect the innocent. The $26 million had long since been recovered and properly distributed through legal channels to fund environmental cleanup, medical treatment, and community development. The environmental crimes had been prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. The railroad industry had been completely reformed under permanent government oversight. Justice had been served comprehensively and permanently. But the real victory was much simpler and more profound. A 12-year-old girl who should have died from corporate negligence had lived to become an environmental protection leader. No other children would suffer and die from preventable environmental crimes because one ordinary man had found the extraordinary courage to risk everything for what was right. Harold Jennings had committed what the law called a perfect crime, not because he was never caught, but because he had never really been a criminal at all. He was a guardian angel in a conductor's uniform who understood that sometimes the most moral action in an immoral situation requires breaking unjust laws to save innocent lives. The freight train robbery that exposed environmental genocide had ended exactly as it should, with children playing safely in clean neighborhoods, families sleeping peacefully in healthy homes, and corporate executives serving long prison sentences, where they belong for crimes against humanity and the environment. The Midnight Run had become a legend of environmental justice that would inspire whistleblowers and ordinary heroes for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.